Did you know that 75% of a retiree's expenses are, in fact, comprised of just four different categories? We're going to talk about what those categories are, plus talk a little bit about how you might be able to reduce some of the expenses in those said categories, along with the fact that sadly we will share some sobering news about the state of retirement readiness in this country. The trend not particularly good and hasn't really been good for a number of years. So we're going to give you some tips to avoid how you can become a statistic, if you will, on that. So all of that is teed up on this week's program here on Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. My name, of course, Joel Garris, certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we've got a team of great people who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries at Nelson Financial Planning. So without further ado, I guess it would only be appropriate to talk a little bit about this week's past headline, right? And obviously, what would immediately come to mind is the debt deal. So the debt deal is done. And so at the end of the day, what's it all mean? I guess as I sat and looked through some of the things that were involved in the debt deal, it struck me that a bit of a much ado about nothing, if you will. Despite all of the headlines and all the fears of, the economy's going to tank and millions of people are going to lose their jobs and the world's going to come to an end, and I guess it's just a big yawn, because at the end of the day, it wound up being a much, I guess a political compromise. I don't know. A bunch of Republicans voted for it, a bunch of Democrats voted for it in both the House and the Senate. Certainly the media and, to a certain extent, politicians certainly tried to sort of scare everybody. I think at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot in it to really talk about from an investing perspective, because it doesn't really address the real issues. I think it was a bill or a quote-unquote compromise that at the end of the day didn't really tackle some of the real issues involving spending. According to the Congressional Budget Office, this bill is estimated to reduce deficits by about $1.5 trillion over the course of the next decade. That's according to the Congressional Budget Office, which I guess if you had a Ouija board, you could probably be as accurate as what the CBO is typically, based upon its track record of kind of estimating this stuff out over the course of time. They don't really have a particularly good track record on that. But at the end of the day, they're saying that it's going to reduce deficits by 1.5 trillion over the course of a decade. That seems like a lot until you realize just how much, gets spent every year. So that's kind of like a fraction of what this country will spend over the course of the next 10 years. So you don't have to be miss much in terms of being off by $1.5 trillion and make the whole estimate of how much this is going to save just sort of blow up. But anyway, we thought it would be good, obviously, on the program to talk about some of the main provisions in it. And first of all, it is a spending bill, and it's the debt limit bill. So it keeps non-military spending roughly flat for the 2024 fiscal year. In essence, that means we're not spending more than what we've already been spending. It does set a 1% cap in terms of on spending, a 1% increase on spending for the fiscal year 2025. So not like we're exactly like tightening the belt and saying we're going to spend a lot less. We're just trying to spend the same, or maybe the same plus 1% of what we have been doing. But what we have been doing, particularly if you think about 2022, is the amount of spending was massive because of the COVID response. So we're like setting the bar weirdly, and that's in that we're saying, oh, we're not going to spend, we're going to try and spend as much as we did the prior year, but the prior year we kind of blew it out. So it's not like we're kind of getting engaged in a belt tightening kind of thing. I guess one of the talking points that you heard about was that for 2023, the bill sort of rolls the spending level back to 2022. Well, again, that doesn't necessarily help. But anyway, so that's the meat of it. In terms of sort of specific provisions, sort of the real, kind of bullet points. I'm sure you've heard about the IRS funding. The deal cuts about $21 billion from the IRS funding that had been previously passed. So the $80 billion that had been previously passed is only going to be about $60 billion. About $1.4 billion is going to be taken back from the agency immediately. So that's sort of piece one. Piece two has to deal with COVID, basically pulling back $27 billion in unspent money. So when you stop and hear that number, it just is staggering that there's that much money that still was unspent from COVID. If that doesn't tell you that they didn't sort of really overshoot it, because it's rare to even have unspent money. But anyway, pulling back $27 billion in unspent COVID money, the work requirements, which seems to be all what the headlines are all about, really, when you actually look at it, isn't really that big of a deal. The only thing that it does do, if you want to get food stamps, which is now called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. I guess that's a better name than food stamps, but it's still the same program. Able-bodied, low-income adults always sort of had that work requirement up to age 49. All that the bill does is push the age 49 up to 54. So I don't really know what the big deal there is all about, but that was a big part of the conversation. It exempts veterans, homeless, and young people leaving foster care, so a large portion of people are exempted from that. At the end of the day, if in order to receive this benefit, can't get it for more than 3 months within a 3-year period unless you are working or enrolled in a work program. And then lastly, it had some oil and gas stuff, some energy project stuff to streamline the environmental reviews, to put that on a 2-year time limit, and to have a single federal agency take control of sort of a project's environmental review so things don't get sort of all bogged down and ultimately languish, if you will. Specifically, it expedited some remaining permits for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which of course is located in West Virginia. So Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia got a little bit of a nod, or I guess a little bit of a, hey, thanks for voting for that Inflation Reduction Act last year. This is what you're getting in return. So a little bit of a politics and a little bit of smoke and mirrors really at the end of the day, because substantively, in our view, it doesn't really change a whole heck of a lot. So there you go. Much ado about nothing, if you will, in terms of the debt deal that was done. Obviously, a lot of details. It's a thick piece of legislation. A lot of details still need to unfold from that. But those are just sort of the general highlights that we wanted to share with our listeners here on the program, given that has been the topic du jour this past week. So we're going to take a break, and when we return, we're going to talk about retiree spending and what 4 categories make up 75% of what a retiree spends on average. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents. So the average retiree spends about $4,345 on monthly expenses, the equivalent of about a little over $52,000 annually. But what's interesting about that number is that about 75% of that spend actually occurs in 4 different categories. So in this segment of the program, we're going to talk about those 4 categories and how you might be able to improve how much you're spending, particularly by paying attention to these 4 categories, because obviously they make up a huge amount of how much the average retiree spends. So welcome on into the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, coming to you on a host of stations throughout the Central Florida region. Also happen to be one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the big wide World Wide Web. And so make sure you subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Apple or even the good folks at iHeartRadio, whatever the case may be. We are on it. Any trouble finding our channel, including our one on YouTube, go to our website, Nelson Financial Planning. And in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a bunch of icons. Click on the one that looks most familiar to you, and you will get immediately connected over to our channel. Once there, be sure and subscribe. That way you know when we put up new content, plus you won't have to kind of search and find us again. Anyway, my name is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning. So average retiree spends a little over $4,300 a month on basically 4 categories, make up about 75% of that number. So what are they, and what are some of the ways in which you might be able to improve on how much you are spending on these categories that clearly make up a bulk of what someone spends? So as you might well imagine, housing takes the largest piece of that, of the 75% that these 4 categories makes up about 36% of that 75%. So nearly half of that has to deal with housing costs, representing the single largest expense for retirees. So what's the strategy there to try and improve on that cost? Well, first and foremost, if you have a mortgage, right, you would want to try and refinance that, or should I say, you should have tried to refinance that back when interest rates were as low as they were, because ultimately, if you're paying a lower rate on that mortgage, well, then you get to pay less money, and certainly the cost in terms of the interest cost is much lower. So certainly looking at the possibilities of refinancing, hopefully that's something you did a year or 2 ago, not necessarily now. That would be one way to improve your expenses. Second way, of course, is to not have the mortgage in the first place, right? And that's certainly a goal that we talk to our clients about, is to make sure that when you go into retirement, then that mortgage is sort of paid off. We're not necessarily big fans of using big chunks of money to try and pay it off in one fell swoop, but rather to build it into your cash flow so that over the course of your working years, you know that by the time you get to the end of those working years, and the end of those years where you've got a regular paycheck coming in, then ultimately that mortgage is fully paid off. So pretty easy to sort of calculate that. There's a lot of online calculators that are available to help with that. You put in the amount that you still owe on the mortgage, your interest rate, and then you put the years until you retire, and then voila, you get the payment that you need to make in order to make sure that that mortgage is paid off when you ultimately get to retirement. So that's a good way to reduce down what is often the biggest expense for retirees. Similarly, you can look at maybe downsizing, right? Maybe you had a bunch of kids, had a bigger house. Now it's just the 2 of you. And so the opportunity to downsize might be a very good way to ultimately really reduce down your expenses associated with home ownership. Now, here's the thing, and this is a comment about sale of your home and the tax implications. And this one really surprises us at how misunderstood the rules are on this particular category. So we want to take a minute and sort of talk this one through. Just this past week, we ran into this where someone did not realize that they didn't have to worry about having to pay the capital gains tax on the profit that they made when they were selling their home. So in this person's case, they were looking to kind of get out of the area, get up to the Panhandle, have a little bit more space, a little less traffic, things like that. But the thing that was holding them back is, well, if I sell the house, I'm going to have to pay so much in taxes because the house I've owned for 30 odd years and it's appreciated so much. And so I'm going to have this tax bill because of this capital gain. And here's the thing. That's not the case at all when it comes to your primary residence. So the rules today, and by the way, they've been the rules for the past 20 years, and it's amazing to me how many people still, to the extent that they know the rules, think back to the old version of the rule. The old version of the rule was that you were allowed to sort of have a one-time, lifetime exemption. When you sold your house, you were able to sort of go through this downsizing process. And if you went through this downsizing process once in your lifetime, then you didn't have to worry about paying the gain on the sale of that house. Well, as you might well imagine, that's kind of hard to keep track of. So the IRS scrapped that rule, and it's been scrapped for 20, maybe even 25 years now, and simply said, look, if you sell your primary residence, as long as it has been your primary residence 2 years of the last 5 years, then you can sell that, and as long as the gain as a single person isn't above 250 or as a married couple isn't above 500, then voila, you don't have to worry about any tax on the gain of that property. So with that rule, you had to live in it for your primary residence 2 of the last 5 years. You could actually do this every 2 years, and each time, assuming that your house was appreciating all the time, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. The reality is, though, that as you saw that house appreciate, if you could do it as often as every 2 years. So know the rules on this one in particular. Just this past week, we had somebody come in that thought that they were going to have to pay taxes on the sale of their primary residence. No. The rules allow you, for a married couple, to exempt the $500,000 of profit that you achieved on the sale of your primary residence. If it's more than $500,000, then all I would have to say is congratulations, but you do have to pay taxes on the excess amount. So remember, downsizing is a great option to help reduce your expenses in retirement. So biggest expense, housing, those are some of the strategies in which you can employ to help improve or lower that expense. Next up on the list, and number 2 and number 3 are almost tied, if you will, is sort of to the transportation costs, right? So the second largest spending category that retirees experience is transportation, making up about $7,000, a little over $7,000 of that roughly $52,000 that on average the average retiree spends each and every year. So transportation costs obviously include things like new cars, car insurance, gas, all of those kinds of things. So what are the strategies there to try and reduce down some of the expenses that are associated with that transportation cost? Well, one of the things you can do is make sure that you can boost your cash savings. Have a good amount of cash savings on hand, particularly now when you actually make some money with cash. And so that when you do go to buy that next vehicle, well, then you can use cash instead of having to finance it. Because if you've looked at financing rates for cars of late, it's really, really expensive. So if you have to borrow money for that car, then that means you're going to have a monthly payment, and that monthly payment is going to be much higher than what it otherwise would have been. So one strategy to help reduce down the cost of this transportation category is to have enough cash so that when you do need a car, you can just use cash for it. We've got a couple of other thoughts on this topic, but we got to take a break. So we're going to take a break and return with this conversation about those main expense categories that retirees spend money on and how, more importantly, you can help improve that situation. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. On the program, we're talking about some of the main categories that the average retiree spends their money on. Interestingly enough, about 75% of the average expenses that a retiree in America spends their money on can be broken down into 4 categories. So obviously, if it's 75%, that's certainly the bulk of what you're spending money on. What are those categories? And more importantly, what are some of the strategies that you can use to help reduce down the expense or the cost of those expense items Prior to the break, we talked about housing. Obviously, that's number one, and some of the strategies to help reduce down the expenses associated there. Number two is sort of this transportation component, which is car and insurance and gas and things like that. Obviously, if you've got cash and cash savings to be able to purchase a car for cash, then that eliminates the cost and the monthly cost of a car loan. Similarly, another suggestion would be to shop around for insurance. I think oftentimes there's a tendency for consumers to stay with the same insurance company for a long time, much like they stay with the same bank for a long time. But you'll find if you shop around, you may actually wind up getting a little bit better cost of insurance by doing that. And then thirdly, if you want to save on your transportation costs, well, then don't rotate a new car into the driveway every 3 years, right? I mean, new cars, they're nice, they're shiny, and you can keep up with the Joneses when you are ultimately getting a car that often. But the reality is that there's a big cost associated with that. So pull back on getting that new car every 3 years, and you'll find that you will be in better shape and have lower expenses as it relates to transportation. So we've got the other two categories to talk about in terms of what the average retiree spends their money on and some strategies that you can follow to help improve your situation in retirement. But we, of course, want to welcome the audience into the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's longest-running radio programs, also a top 25 financial planning podcast on the World Wide Web. My name, of course, is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner and certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great people who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries who stand ready this week to help you improve your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So give us a call at the office this week to see how they can help you. So next category of those expenses, as you might well imagine, is healthcare. And this one I suspect is going to become the second largest here in the next few years because, as we all know, cost of healthcare really increasing at a pretty good clip, probably going to overtake that transportation as the second largest expense item that retirees use on a regular basis when they're in retirement. But at the end of the day, healthcare spending makes up about $7,000 of annual spending for retirees. Things like preventable care, screening, vaccinations. Obviously, when it comes to healthcare, right, there's some things that you can do to help maybe keep that cost down, right? You have to take care of yourself would be chief among them, right? Make sure you're exercising. Make sure you're walking. A lot of people talk about walking. I still prefer to run, but obviously sometimes you're not able to do that as time goes by. So the value of a good walk is one of the biggest things from a health perspective that has a lot of benefits to it. And then, take the meds, right? If the doctor says take the meds, take the meds. You're supposed to be on blood pressure medicine, take it. I take mine every day, and that helps to keep everything in better control, keeps me healthier along the way. So make sure you're taking your meds. Might be a good way, those two strategies, going for a walk, taking the meds, good strategies to help reduce down what could be potentially the expenses associated with your healthcare needs in retirement. And then lastly, we all got to eat, right? So the fourth biggest category that retirees spend their money on is, of course, food. Unfortunately, food is probably the biggest area of inflation that we've seen over the course of the past few months. The notion of going to the grocery store, eating out, things like that is probably an area where we've seen the biggest increase in cost, the biggest impact of inflation. Strategies there include some just general common sense strategies when it comes to try and reduce down how much you are spending, right? First and foremost, budget is always a good idea to keep track of your expenses. By keeping track of them, oftentimes you'll find that, hey, there's ways that I can perhaps use my money better than what I am doing it. Those daily trips to Starbucks do kind of add up when you stop and think about it. But other strategies involve things like meal planning, so that way you don't throw it away. The amount of waste at the grocery store is just tremendous. It seems like every week I'm throwing stuff away at our house, and that's just a waste of money. If you kind of do some meal planning, then you can try and reduce that. Similarly, when you shop, make sure you take a grocery list, get only what's on the list, make sure you pick up those items that are on sale. And what's the other traditional one that people talk about? Don't go grocery shopping on an empty stomach, because you're going to wind up with a much fuller cart than what you expect. With the 3 boys home this summer, my young adults, I have noticed that the food bill has gone up quite a bit across the board. So certainly an area where folks spend a lot of money, but those are some of the strategies in which to try and improve those expenses. So to recap, average retiree spends about $4,000, about almost $4,400 a month on these 4 categories of expenses. That's housing, transportation, healthcare, and food. Hopefully, you're able to incorporate some of those strategies we've talked about in this segment, in the prior segment, in terms of reducing down some of those related expenses on these big cost items. So certainly some things to think about as it relates to expenses, particularly in retirement, and how to improve them. So we're going to shift some gears and talk about some of the sobering news that we have seen out there in some of the studies. And this has really sort of been an ongoing trend over the course of the past probably few years, maybe even a couple of decades, where we continue to see the retirement readiness that Americans have is going in the wrong direction. And so when you think about financial confidence for retirement, that recently took perhaps the steepest drop since 2008, according to a recent survey by the Employee Benefit Research Institute. So as a result of all that has been going on, we've seen the steepest drop in sort of financial confidence for retirement, the biggest drop since 2008, which of course was the heart of the financial crisis. So there's a lot of things to sort of unpack in terms of some of the root causes behind that, and sort of what you can do to help address that, because the numbers are certainly relatively rough in terms of the some of the survey numbers. So the average American, and we'll just kind of give you some of the highlights on some of these reports and studies that have come out of late. The average American will only have about 78% of the income they'll need in retirement, according to, this is a study from Fidelity. The same study from Fidelity found that adults were less prepared for retirement now than they were just 3 years ago. That average American only being on track to have about 78% of their income that they'll need in retirement. Actually, a relatively big drop from just where those numbers were back in January of 2020. So about 3 years ago, that number, that 78% number, was actually up to 83%. Obviously, over the past 3 years, there's been a number of things that have happened, right? We've got the COVID pandemic, a bear market based upon the market decline in last year, 2022, and then, of course, record inflation. So those are kind of the 3 things that are lurking in the background. So some of that decline in retirement readiness can sort of make sense, I guess. But more importantly, rather than just kind of having it make sense, we want to talk on the program today about some of the strategies that you can use to help address some of this stuff that has been happening out there. Because according to the survey from Fidelity, there's actually sort of 2 primary factors as to why that retirement readiness has declined. And so we want to get into what those factors are and how you can kind of work through those particular factors to improve your retirement readiness. So we're going to take a break. When we get back, we're going to continue this conversation about retirement readiness and some of the things that you can do to help improve your situation. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So according to a recent study from Fidelity, retirement readiness in decline, down pretty dramatically from where that retirement readiness indicator was just 3 years ago. According to the Employee Benefit Research Institute, the Americans' financial confidence in retirement took the biggest drop since 2008 recently. So what are some of the reasons behind that, and how might you be able to address those so that it doesn't have quite as big of impact on your retirement? Well, obviously, the COVID pandemic, record inflation, and a market decline last year are the soup, the main ingredients in the soup, if you will. But there's a couple of other reasons that are based upon the interviews that were done suggest that people are not making particularly good decisions in terms of how they are reacting to these headlines. So we're going to get into that in this segment of the program. So welcome on in to Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. We're one of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, also one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the World Wide Web. I think on average we have about 1,000 plus downloads a month of our program on the various podcast platforms out there. So we certainly appreciate our podcast listening audience. Make sure you subscribe to us once you find us on your favorite podcast platform. Any trouble, go to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com, and look for the icons that will immediately connect you over to our particular channels, including our channel on YouTube as well. So my name, of course, is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great people who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well, who stand ready this week to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. Boy, tell you what, successful, important. Cost-effective, equally important, because remember, the higher the cost, that means the lower the net return to you. And as an investor, it's all about the net return. That's the piece that you actually keep. So make sure you know what the costs are when you're working with someone and creating a financial plan. Anyway, on to retirement readiness and sort of the two behavioral issues that this most recent study found that ultimately are hurting people's retirement readiness more than they might realize. And obviously, you've got the headlines over the past 3 years of COVID and a bear market in 2022 and inflation. And all of those are big pieces of the puzzle that are affecting human behavior and affecting your decision-making ability, because what the study concluded is there was actually two different things that were causing people to be less retirement ready, and it has to deal with human reaction to the current headlines. The first of which is that people were in fact saving less. Versus to 2020, people are saving less money. Well, if you're trying to get ready for retirement and you're saving less money, then you're not going to be as ready for retirement than if you were saving more money. But a lot of times people sort of say, well, I'm just going to spend the money now and not worry about it because of all of these negative headlines. I just want to spend money and feel happy and not have to worry about what the headlines might be. Well, if that's the case, then you're taking that short-term gain for long-term pain and reducing down your retirement readiness. And then what the study also concluded, beyond the fact that people were saving less money, is that they were investing more conservatively. And this, I think, is a real issue and becoming an even greater one, because a lot of people have become very enamored with money market rates, CD rates, and things like that. And that's not to say that that's not a great option for your cash or your emergency funding savings. It certainly is, and that's great that it is paying a little bit of interest. But if you're thinking about using that as an investment strategy, it fundamentally is not going to work. It's not going to improve your overall retirement readiness. I think it's interesting to see and hear people talk about this, because the perception of what your net return is is still hasn't really changed when you think about cash relative to inflation, right? So today, great, I can get a money market that's generating 4.5%, but if inflation is 6, well, then that means you're still losing 1.5%. Okay, well, think back 3, 4, 5 years ago, sort of that 10, 12-year period where inflation was pretty low, like 1.5%, 2%. What was your interest rate on your money market? It was basically 0. So in that environment, you were losing about 1.5 or so to inflation. It's the same amount that you're losing to inflation now. So it's not really any different in terms of the spread and the losing battle to inflation. I guess maybe it just feels a little different because if at 4.5, you can actually kind of see money coming into the account, but you can't ignore the invisible impact that is inflation. Inflation is always out there. So whether inflation is 2% and your money market's paying you 0, or inflation is at 6, 6.5, and the money market's paying you 4.5, you're still losing the same amount of territory. But unfortunately, a lot of people are kind of looking at these absolute numbers and ultimately steering themselves to be more conservatively invested than they really should be. So there's a number of other surveys that have come out of late that sort of underscore all of these issues with retirement readiness. There was a Bankrate study that found that 55% of Americans were falling short, with 35% of them significantly behind where they needed to be for retirement. The Federal Reserve even concluded that 26% of workers in the year 2021 had no retirement savings at all. So that's a pretty dramatic situation. So what are some of the root causes and how to avoid it? Well, obviously inflation, rising prices, 9% last year, 6% this year. Inflation remains a big issue, and it goes back to what we were talking about, is you got to have a return that's going to do better than inflation. Not only that, because inflation, when you think about inflation, remember the inflation is a cumulative number, right? So if one year you're at 9% inflation and the next year you're at 6% inflation, guess what your total inflation is over the course of the past 2 years? Is 15%. So that's not an insignificant amount, because the inflation amount and the inflation rate, there is a compounding effect on that. If you think about inflation, 1 year is at 9 and 1 year is at 6, that means in that 2-year period, things went up by like 15%. So obviously the solution there is to make sure that you are budgeting and really keeping track of the expenses and how you are spending your money. Nearly half of retirees say that they are spending more than what was expected. Well, that makes sense, because I think a lot of models over the course of the past decade were assuming inflation at like a 1 or 2% rate. And the reality is that historically inflation is kind of closer to 4. So you've got to make sure that you're creating the right assumptions when you're trying to project out retirement income, particularly over an extended period of time. So stock market volatility, we talked about that last year, 2022, S&P 500 for the calendar year down about 19%. And ultimately that's driving people to be more conservative. As we've said many times on this program, more important to be consistent with your investment approach and be diversified. I think we talked a month or so ago about being a boring investor, right? And staying consistent and staying diversified, rather than try and look for those shiny new ways to invest money. Healthcare costs, another obviously big cost of that, along with some unrealistic expectations. We may talk a little bit more about this on a future program, but we got to wrap it on up and get on out of here. So thanks for listening to the program. If you like what you heard, visit NelsonFinancialPlanning.com to learn more about us. This is Joel Garris. Have a great rest of your day.